Hello and welcome to episode 153 of שומר סף Gatekeeper. אם אתם שומעים אותנו באודיו ואתם לא נוח לכם באנגלית, אתם מוזמנים לעבור לוידאו, שם יהיו לנו כותרות תרגום באדיבות אליזבת רימיני, מחבר את הספר איך לנצח דמוקרטיה. And I've been waiting for this episode for quite some time. We have a special guest today on the show, Mr. John Fonte. Hello, John.
Hi, Gotti.
And as I do for special occasions, I bring my secret weapon called Mike Duran. Hi, Mike.
Hi. How are you?
I'm good. And you're both. Are you in adjacent rooms because you're both senior fellows at Hudson?
Down the hall.
Down the hall. And John is also the head of the Center for American Common Culture. And I have to say a word about how all this came to be, because I gave a talk at Hudson about my book, Nayadim and Nayachim. I guess in English I'd call it Global Elites and National Citizens. And after I finished the talk, John came up to me with a little folder and gave me an article he wrote. He said, I may be interested in it. And then I began to discover that everything I tried to say using the example of Israel, John said about 20 years earlier, first using the Durban conference and the United States. And then with his book, which I will now show you on screen, a book called Sovereignty or Submission, Will Americans Rule Themselves or Be Ruled by Others? So, John, the theme that you began to sense already in 2002 when you wrote your article about Durban is that a new kind of, you call it transnational progressivism, is actually directly aimed at undermining democracy. How did you come to formulate that observation?
Yes, well, from, I guess, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1989, there developed the philosophy of the ideology of global governance, where this is the classic political question: who rules, who should rule, under what principles? And the idea came that, well, rules should be global solutions. Global problems require global solutions. So we need some kind of transnational or global structure to rule the world. Now with the end of the Cold War, there's this possibility. And then you had all these developments in the 90s. You had Frank Fukuyama's book. Well, his essay of 1989, and then his book.
The End of History.
Yeah, The End of History. That essentially meant that all ideological and philosophical questions had been solved, and it was the triumph of liberal democracy, liberalism, individual rights, freedom of speech, press, and so on, and then democracy, majority rule. My sort of analysis of Fukuyama right at the point is he's totally wrong, because what's developed and what we're seeing in world politics and in the actions of the United Nations, actions for the United States and Israel, is the development of something quite different. Instead of liberalism, which is individual rights, free speech, and so on, it's really post-liberal, because the emphasis is not on the individual citizen, but on the group, particularly the so-called oppressed or marginalized group that one's born into, really, or seeks to change now with the transgender issue. So it's really post-liberal, but from a left point of view than from a right, and it's post-democratic in the sense that decision making is transferred from the parliaments or congresses of democratic nation states to transnational or global institutions, to the European Union, the European Commission, or the International Criminal Court, or the World Trade Organization. So in a sense, it's post-democratic. It's post-national. That is, the nation state is now supposed to take a sort of a subordinate role to these global institutions, and that means post-American. It means post-Zionist, and so on. And it's even post-Western, because Western leaders no longer talk about the West, but sort of a global civilization, and they've sort of moved beyond it. By post, I mean, of course, moving beyond. So that's what happened with liberalism, with democracy. So I think Fukuyama was fundamentally wrong. So that was my starting point.
And you say, if I may add, that he considered enemies from without. He thought the fall of communism ended ideological competition, but what you say he didn't realize is that the enemy of liberalism could come from within.
Exactly, that's what appeared, and so this new force, and it's gone under different names. I coined the term transnational progressive. But there's also transnational pragmatism. In other words, it's not simply an ideology. There's material actors and social forces that benefit from this. That would be the vast bureaucracy of the European Commission, the European Union, obviously the UN Commission, the UN Human Rights Council, the various institutions that were set up after World War II, like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. The idea may have made sense. They may have been as part of the American world order right after World War II, but it's moved from that to be part of the transnational progressive world order. You look, who are the bureaucrats that staff the WTO? What kind of decisions are made? Their decisions are made there by an alternative body, which really makes nations beyond the nation state. So you have material forces, and particularly you have global corporations.
You know, Gadi, your introduction of John was very polite and respectful, but I think we need to note that John is almost or for years. I think now the world has caught up to him, but for a decade he was pretty much a lone voice on these these issues. Every intellectual knows Francis Fukuyama's name. But every intellectual doesn't know John's name because he's been operating alone. So it's really quite a remarkable achievement that he thought through all of these things before anybody else, pretty much laboring alone. I mean, John, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what it's been like. Maybe you had more of a cohort than I'm aware of. But the other thing I just want to make everybody aware of is that John played a very big role in defining the ideology of the Trump administration. He was they read him in the Trump administration. They based speeches on his ideas, and so on. So he's actually that rare thing, a lone intellectual who has really moved the entire discussion of these issues.
Everybody was quoting the guy who was wrong instead of quoting the guy who was right. Fukuyama just made a career by a huge mistake. So it was indeed a difficult thing to spot so early. And the way you start, John, your article on liberal democracy versus transnational progressivism, which appeared in 2002, was the Durban conference. And you mentioned a large group of American NGOs. You probably know this, but we are the ultimate, Israel is the ultimate NGO playground, right? Every NGO in the world can get huge funds if they only start talking about the human rights and the Palestinians. And what you said there is that essentially the move that they made in the name of human rights was an anti-democratic move, because they said, well, the US government is not doing enough. Let's force it through outside forces.
Yes, exactly. That's the Durban, the Declaration of Durban. It was a group of prominent American NGOs, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Human Rights First, at that time called the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, the NAACP, the ACLU, La Raza. These are major American institutions who were once liberal, now whatever you want to call it, progressive, and so on. But they said we cannot, we're not getting we're not getting what we want through the process of American liberal democracy. And what did they want? If you look at their demands, One of them was for reparations for slavery. Others were that the United States adhere to all treaties without reservations. The United States often signs an international treaty, but makes a reservation declaring that nothing in the treaty shall surpass the U.S. Constitution, or if it's in contradiction of the Constitution, it's not valid. So the NGOs wanted to overturn all this. But so what they were rejecting was essentially the democratic process, both in the U.S. Congress and in the state legislatures, that defeated all these or didn't bring them up or were not interested in passing the NGO agenda. And of course, the NGOs are backed, like Human Rights Watch, particularly, and Amnesty International, tremendous funding from American philanthropies, the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, Stuart Mott, the Soros Open Society Foundation. So they get enormous funds to promote what is not human rights or democracy, but is a narrow partisan political agenda. And they did this from the beginning, and they're responsible actually for some international treaties, particularly the Rome Statute, creating the International Criminal Court, the ICC. And there's been, as you know, a tremendous battle for that for 20 years. And currently, as we talk, there's a investigation right now by the ICC of Israel's activities in the Palestinian Authority, which itself is a violation of the Rome Statute, because you have to supposedly be a nation state to be a party to the ICC, and Palestine Authority is not a nation state. But the current investigation is investigation of activities taking place in the state of Palestine. And there was an investigation of the U.S. In Afghanistan, which they've since dropped, because right now they realize they have to focus on Ukraine. But the ultimate goal, the ultimate agenda of the NGOs and the Western philanthropy, and this, what I call in the book, the party of global governance, it should be seen as a distinct political movement with not just an ideology, but a social base, material base, where people benefit, and as I mentioned, transnational pragmatists as well as transnational progressives. So they challenge the democratic state. They challenge liberal democracy, and this is what I first saw in the 90s and the aughts. And then this went on for a while, and then there was sort of a populist revolt, which we've seen starting maybe in the United States with the Tea Party movement. And you had nation states pushing back against transnationalism. And the first pushback was from Israel, actually. It was in about 2008-9, was Ron Dermer under the Netanyahu administration that said, we're not going to allow the NGOs to have this moral halo. Because ultimately, this is a moral conflict. It's a moral conflict over the deepest issues of politics, going back to Aristotle. We could sum it up. I have a 450-page book, but we can sum it up in 2 words. Who governs? Yeah. You know, is it a democratic people, independent people, or is it global forces? And you could say in a way that goes back to the Hebrew Bible even.
John, you a minute ago, you said that it was partisan political. But I think I'd like to get you to discuss a little bit about the way transnational, the way the globalism maps onto the political party map in the United States. Because the big surprise for me, I'd love to get your views on this, but the big surprise for me when Trump got elected was that a big chunk of the Republican Party was actually on board with the transnationalists.
Yes. Again, for one thing, politics in the United States and in Israel and Europe and in Asia no longer stops at the water's edge. You look at the Iran deal, which Mike's an expert on. There's a 180-degree difference, whether it was Obama or Biden, or whether Trump was the president of the United States. The attitude, I mean, the whole shift of the Iran deal, and this is the whole treatment of the International Criminal Court. When the International Criminal Court launched an investigation of the United States, possible war crimes in Afghanistan. The response from Obama and now from Biden is, well, let's talk to them and let's walk them through this and not ruffle any feathers, but maybe we can behind the scenes stop it. Where the attitude of the Trump administration was, well, they want to come to the United States, so we're going to slap sanctions on them. We're going to cut off all technical support for the International Criminal Court, not give them any intelligence for their cases. And we may even arrest their investigators when they decides to come to the United States. So it was total opposition.
This goes back to the administration Mike served in the Security Council, National Security Council under George W. Bush, which, if I'm not mistaken, they passed a bill called the Invasion of Hague bill, right? Am I right, Mike?
Sorry, I'm not familiar with this. So John,
it's the American Service Members Protection Act, which essentially said if Article 99 of the and the purpose was to get countries signed they would not prosecute, they wouldn't cooperate with the International Criminal Court in prosecuting American soldiers
and use any means. This is why it got this nickname that they are going to invent.
So it's called the Hague Invasion Act or whatever.
Yeah.
So that was done under Bush. That was reversed under Obama. It's and then once again under Trump, this was brought back, and we again refused to cooperate with the ICC because there was a lot of cooperation during the Obama period and now the Biden. By cooperation, I meaning providing technical support to the International Criminal Court, which is a political institution which is specifically targeted the United States and Israel. And this is clear if you go back to the Rome Statute, the meetings in Rome where they passed the International Criminal Court. The United States made had an amendment on the floor of this UN treaty at the conference in Rome, and said we want this to be up to the Security Council of the United Nations, so we'd have a veto. And the forces in the room defeated the U.S. resolution. They not only defeated it, but they had 10 minutes of sustained cheering, of clapping, that sustained, that sort of thing. That went on for 12 minutes when the United States was defeated. So this shows
it's like under Stalin, where they couldn't stop clapping.
Exactly, or Saddam Hussein. This showed the mindset of the global governance movement. This was ICC was directly targeting the U.S. and Israel, and they're still targeting Israel as we speak in this current case. So that's the sort of the mindset of the.
But is it true that
global governance party?
Is it true that the Republicans? I'm going back to Mike's question. That the Republicans were basically on board until Trump came along and just disrupted this whole bipartisan consensus.
I would say they were half on board. I mean, they were thinking in terms they wanted to promote globalism in the 90s. Then also when maybe the first, they made the first Bush 41 talked about a new world order. So they didn't. I think they didn't see the global progressive movement, the transnational progressive movement. And when it did appear in the universities, they would say, "Well, that's just university professors. That has no meaning. Don't worry about them." So they were sort of naive, I think, in dismissing it. And then came 9/11. Then all of a sudden, 1 month after 9/11, in October, the United States started bombing Taliban places in Afghanistan, and immediately, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch charged the United States with war crimes, bombing civilians and so on. And this is October of 2001, 30 days after 9/11. And what the war crimes that they were saying, the United States is violating the Geneva Convention, 1949. And we all know about the Geneva Convention, the Nuremberg laws, and so on. Well, the United States was not violating. The United States, what actually was happening was the United States was not on board with additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, which passed in 1977, which was a special amendment, a special edition supported by the Soviet bloc and by the non-aligned bloc, the global South. And this was specifically aimed at Israel and Western democracies that might be fighting guerrillas or terrorists or non-conventional forces. So this is 1970. The United States is not a party to it. So in other words, even the NGOs...
What did the article say, though?
The article changed the rules of war. And just to give one quick example, I don't want to get into the weeds too much here, but let's say there's a mob, a crowd, and there's terrorists hidden within this mob. The terrorists jump out from the mob and they fire on Western democratic forces, Israel, Britain, United States. At that point, they're a combatant. If they jump back into the crowd, they're not a combatant, and the Israeli forces, the American forces, can't go then and apprehend them into the crowd because they're a non-combatant. So they changed the rules of war. Also, they said you have to, before a bombing raid, you have to inform the enemy that we're coming, so all civilians can be cleared out. Israel actually does this now to an extent. They don't have to. They're not a party to the Additional Protocol 1 of 1977. So it gets complicated, but essentially the NGOs are changing the rules of the game and changing the rules of war and pretending this is all about Nuremberg and the Geneva Convention when it's not.
One of the topics that you started dealing with already in the early essay and then later in the book and other works is the use of human rights and equality to basically remove all obstacles from immigration.
Yes, exactly. Right from the beginning, migrant rights were the right of a person to expatriate. Means leave the country, that's fine. But it's also the right of the host country to accept or reject people. Essentially, we can think of it this way. Who makes the decisions about immigration? And there are three possibilities. One is the nation state decides how many, who can come in, how many people they want. They can have an immigration policy. So we want a certain number of immigrants. They have certain standards. So the democratic nation state would make that decision. That's the United States, Israel, France, Britain. So number one, decision can be made by the democratic nation state. Number two, decisions could be made by a transnational body. So there's the UN Migration Commission, which says, well, we should make the decisions. Or the European, so that's a transnational, supranational institution making the decisions, not a democratic.
They now have that's jumping ahead in time, but they now have a covenant of the universal right for immigration, which the United States refused to sign, and as did we. Right,
exactly. So this would, or you could have the European as when it will make this decision as opposed to Italy or Hungary or Poland or France or some individual nation. So that's the second possibility.
John, we had a little gap in the sound.
The third possibility is the migrant.
We had a little gap in the sound. If you can repeat the second point. Yeah.
Okay. As I say, our first possibility, democratic states make the decision. Second possibility, supranational organizations such as the United Nations or the European Union make the decisions. We talked about the migrant conventions. It's a human right to emigrate anywhere in the world, and the host nation has no say in it. So that's number two, supranational. Number three is the migrant decides. Well, I'm just going, and I'm going to come with or without the consent of the government. So this the governed, with or without the consent of the governed. So essentially, both point two, the supranationals deciding, or point three, the migrant themselves deciding, violates the core principle of liberal democracy, which is government by consent of the governed. That goes back to the American Declaration of Independence, the Israeli, the foundation of Israel, the foundation of any democratic state. So the migrants can come here then without consent. They just come. And the other case is supranational. So those are the three possibilities. And that's what we're faced with. That's the moral question. So the transnationalists often say this is a moral question. Soros will say that. He's right. It is a moral question. So who decides? Does a democratic society have the right to make its own decisions and the right to actually to reproduce itself? We want Israel chooses, as a homeland for Jews throughout the world, and that's the decisions they've made. So they want a Jewish state. They want a particular type of democratic state. Historically, America's had a process of Americanization, or what I call a patriotic assimilation, where you accept the symbols and cohesions and you become an American. You immigrate from another country, but like my grandparents did from Italy, but you become an American patriot. That was the traditional view. That view is now being surpassed by these other, what we just discussed. So in this case, a democratic people makes its own decision. So does a democratic state have the right to reproduce itself or not? American political theorist, a couple decades back, Wilmore Kendall, said the greatest right of all is the right of a free people to rule themselves. And if we follow the NGOs, if we follow their understanding of human rights, their understanding of what is global democracy, then these independent states don't have this human right. So that's the greatest question of all today. And Fukuyama doesn't go into it, and these other theorists have not really gone into this question.
This is the core of Israel's Declaration of Independence. When we teach that to students, when asked what is the central tenet, it's actually beautiful in English too. It's beautiful in the Hebrew, in Ben Gurion's Hebrew. What it says, it is the right of the Jewish people to be like all peoples, masters of their own fate in their own sovereign state. That is the definition of what is attacked when you use human rights in the way that these NGOs use them. And we see this now. Maybe I can get both of you to comment on this. The immigration is sprawled into a huge issue in Israel too, but in America it's one of the central issues of political campaigns now. Where is this administration basically just plainly promoting the global governance view of things?
I don't think there's any question that they're promoting open borders in the hope of, they think it's to their political advantage.
So the reason is just these people will vote Democrat? That's what they believe, and that's
they're thinking that. Of course, it turns out after a while they don't. It does take a while. You take the situation of the Mexican-American population on the border in the Rio Grande. They did vote Democrat. They did vote left-wing for 100 years since, the Mexican Revolution of the 1920s when they came and when they first came. But that's changed. Many elements of people have now been assimilated patriotically, and they're now rejecting that. But I would say yes, the Biden administration, and even earlier under Obama, they're accepting both open borders and they're accepting some of this transnational ideology that people have the right to leave and to come into a country without the consent of the government. Actually, Jefferson in the Notes on Virginia wrote about the right of expatriation, that people do have the right to leave a country, but the host country has the right to determine who comes. So he explained this all right even before the formation of the United States in the notes in his notes on the state of Virginia, written in the 1780s. And this is a core, as you just said, a core premise of politics. And then I think what you just read, Ben Gurion's statement, is probably the single most important question in global politics today. So I've suggested looking at global politics through a bifocal lens. Democratic nation states, democratic sovereigns are challenged by two factors. One, by these hostile nation states, China, Iran, Russia, and so on, but also challenged by this internal and external challenge of global governance, which would also which would end their independence and also in a different, which is also in a sense an existential struggle. And what's happened since I wrote the book in 2011, 2012, is the formation of a party of democratic sovereigntists, of democratic nationalists, of what's called now sort of national conservatism. And this started Israel's pushback against the NGOs. It happened with Brexit, with Boris Johnson. It happened with Trump. and his new emphasis on sovereignty, and it's happened with Netanyahu. It's happened in a sense with Orban and Kaczynski in Europe, and in some of the conservative elements, maybe in Britain and France. So people are pushing back. We could call this national conservatism or democratic nationalism, and it's based on democratic sovereignty. So it's not just the sovereignty of a place like North Korea. It's when the people are sovereign, not necessarily just a ruling elite, but the people themselves make decisions, their sovereignty. That was a big part of the Trump administration's pushback. The national strategy, sovereignty was written into the national strategy document for the first time in American history. When President Trump spoke at the United Nations, he mentioned sovereignty 23 times, and Dan Henninger of the Wall Street Journal, and this is classic establishment conservatives, that what is he talking about with this sovereignty? And this gets back to your earlier question, that were the Republicans quite understanding this? And I think Henninger is a very intelligent guy at the Wall Street Journal. He's on their editorial board. Excuse me. Yeah, we knew what Trump was talking about. Trump was talking about sovereignty, and the Journal and, say, establishment conservatives are also for a form of sovereignty, but they were also a little nervous because they want the World Trade Organizations. They want a certain level of globalization that moves beyond sovereignty. So they have a problem. There's a principal problem here of philosophy. They want to accept part of globalization and not the rest of it. So Trump did challenge this.
The conservatives were as on board as the liberals with the integration of China into the World Trade Organization, and believed and I'm talking about back in the year 2000, and they believed in the Fukuyama conception that by integrating, end of history, that by integrating China into the World Trade Organization, we were going to democratize China. If it wasn't going to become a democracy, it was going to become a much softer authoritarianism, one in which the Communist Party was going to be operating as a kind of manager of China Incorporated. It was going to be much more responsive to the middle class in China, and there was going to be a much more consensual system there, and that was also going to lead to greater cooperation between China and the United States, less competition, because the two of them were going to be partners in managing this global economy. And no one imagined back in 2000, not Republicans or Democrats, that the Chinese might keep their desire to subvert the United States and to actually subvert the whole global order that the United States leads by working within the capitalist system. One of the things that amazes me.
Let me make one point on that, Mike.
Sure.
You're absolutely right, and I actually discussed this in the book. Strobe Talbot wrote about serious talks with Bill Clinton when Bill Clinton was president, and Clinton said, well, what are we going to do 20, 30, 40 years from now when the United States is no longer top dog and China might be? He said, well, what we have to do is make sure they're brought into the system and they internalize the rules. That we have to get the Chinese to internalize the rules of the global order. This was Clinton talking to Talbot. He lays this all out. It's in the book, actually. It's from Talbot's own discussions with Clinton. And then you're right, the Republicans were totally on board with that.
So one of the things that's really striking to me is that this has, John situated it for our discussion in the post-Cold War moment, the end of history moment, but it also has deep roots in American culture, in American religious culture, and it gives these guys an extra card to play, which they're playing now. And I think the same thing exists in Israel, Gadi. I think it'd be interested to get your response. So they, with respect to immigration, the Democrats for sure are playing the immigration card in order to get electoral advantage in the open borders card to get electoral advantage in our system. And they're in an interesting philosophically, they're able to toggle back and forth depending upon the context between absolutely, full Soros-like support for open borders, or just making sure that they're the ones who control the question of immigration, so that you can't have a Republican executive in charge of it. As long as they're in charge of it and they can decide who comes in and who doesn't come in, then they're okay. There was a very interesting moment, I think it was back in 2016, maybe 2015, when somebody asked Bernie Sanders, that is, left-wing progressive, how he felt about open borders, and he said, no, we can't have that, because he was coming at it from a traditional left-wing, kind of Marxist point of view, where the job of the Democratic Party is to look after the working class. And if you flood the country with a lot of uneducated migrants who want to do work, you're going to undermine the situation of the working class citizen, because it's a diminution or a dilution of citizenship, and he's concerned about the working class. Now, Bernie Sanders, in a moment of candor, he said we can't have that, but of course, now he's not going to make that kind of statement, because it's become kind of a plank of the Democratic Party that they let all the migrants in. But they're capable of toggling back and forth between the two conceptions when it's to their advantage. But when they get opposition to it, what they can do in the cultural debate, which is so powerful, is they immediately accuse you of being a racist. So it's not that you're in favor of democracy and citizenship and sovereignty and so forth. It's you're a racist against those migrants. And in American culture, the worst thing you can be is a racist. And the last thing you want to be, if you're a corporation or just an individual in a workplace, the last place you want to be is to say, no, I'm not a racist, but, right? That's a completely losing position.
Well, this brings up again the key issue is it's whoever seizes the moral high ground will ultimately win, whether it'll be democratic sovereigntists or transnational progressives. So what you just described was an attempt to seize the moral high ground. But interesting, I could add another post. It's post-citizenship. I mean, the entire transnational progressive or globalist viewpoint is a repudiation of the concept of citizenship, not just the nation, the citizen.
Victor Hansen's recent book is called The Dying Citizen, and attacks the same question from exactly this angle. And if I might add humbly, I while criticizing Yuval Noah Harari, who is an international star of the globalist movement, my question was, in their utopia, or in his utopia, where is citizenship? Because if you read these, this is not political theory, right? This is literary prose. It's a weaving of utopian dreams, and everything there is administrative. There's no politics. Yeah. There's no citizenship, and there's no accountability. So the whole thing undermines not just the general principle of government with the consent of the governed. It has no conception of citizenship, whatever. And
I think, yes, that's why. Sorry, if I could just jump in and make one point. This is another thing that I've discovered in the last 4 or 5 years that shocked me, was that the view that you're describing is absolutely the kind of fantasy of a lot of my colleagues here in Washington, D.C., that the utopia that they dream of is the managed society. And they really love the idea of expertise and of management by wise managers rather than the actual consent of the governed. And they really don't like the governed at all. But aside from their hostility to the governed, this is their dream. I mean, because they are, of course, part of the managerial elite, so it's very useful to them. But to me, it's such an ugly vision, but it really looks beautiful to a lot of people.
All these parks, green lungs, and aerial rails, and all that. It looks wonderful. And this, by the way, goes back to an older American tradition in the progressive era, and actually in the beginning of the 20th century, when administration was professionalized in some sense. But I wanted to make a Marxist remark, if I may. I don't do this very often, but there is a class economic element to it all, because and I tried to say, Mike knows the Hebrew terms that I used. They're not very good. Not as good as John Goodhart's, the anywheres and the somewheres, but I call them the mobile class. They're not exactly mobile. They're possibly international, but they also have an idea of a mobile proletariat. And so Bernie Sanders was exactly right in his old social democratic instincts when he was protecting the American working class, whereas this elite doesn't care where the workers come from, and immigration for it is cheap labor. So the top strata of society is internationalist and mobile, and it seeks to have a mobile working force with which it aligns itself. And what happened in America, to the extent that I understand, and much of it is what Mike helped me understand, is that the new populism is actually also the new working class ideology, so that the deplorables or the people that vote Trump were the people who were losing their jobs because of this alliance between the mobile elite and the mobile proletariat. Does that strike you as true, John?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. So we're talking about an oligarchy. So it goes back to classic political science, democracy versus oligarchy. And the oligarchy is progressive and transnational. And in fact, I also mentioned this in the book. There was a discussion by about global corporations that one leading, apparently a CEO of an American company, not named at the time, said, well, if we look at the global market and our policies of globalization, if one or two Americans fall out of the middle class and 4 or 5 Chinese rise to the middle class, that's a pretty good rate, 4 to 1. We're helping people. So just throwing out the whole concept of citizenship of your own country. And this was an interview by the current, she was later the foreign minister of Canada, and when she was a journalist, had an interview with this American CEO who basically gave the game away.
Oh, so we know who that is, because I came across this in Michael Anton's book, The Stakes, which is the most pessimistic book written since the book of Job.
Right, maybe that incident.
I want to. I don't want to derail the conversation, but Gadi, let's not finish this without bringing up this pessimism issue that you just mentioned. I have some questions for John. I have a couple of observations and a question for John. Can I go ahead and jump into it? I thought
I think we can go a little over time. So let's say we have 10 minutes more.
Okay. Gadi, you mentioned the pessimism of Michael Anton, and it's something. Michael Anton's a very brilliant guy, but he represents a certain aspect of American conservative thinking that I really don't like, which is that American conservatives, they always think it's 5 minutes to midnight, or like maybe 5 minutes after midnight, and
it's flight 93. Yeah.
It's flight 93. Yeah, and it's where civilization itself is about to be destroyed by the left, and really there's only like 3 or 4 patriots left, and if we don't all band together and do something dramatic, then the game is entirely over. And I just want to ask. By the way, I can't say that I'm particularly optimistic at this point, because there have all these structural changes in America have taken place in my lifetime that have shocked me. I mean, when I grew up, so many of the people around me were in some way or another involved in industry, in companies that actually made stuff, and they were actually involved themselves in the making, not just the selling or the marketing or the whatever. Today, you never meet anyone who actually makes anything. Right? It's all moved to China, and it happens so quickly. The constituencies that might want to fight for that are gone. But I want to ask John about this pessimism. question. Is he John? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Are you a optimist? What are you?
I'm neither one. I think it's an open struggle, and if we're interested in preserving democratic sovereignty in the United States and Israel, we have to fight for it. I think it depends on agents. I don't believe in the arc of history going one way or the other. The whole explosion, what happened since I've written the book, as I mentioned, Brexit, the election of Trump, the role of Netanyahu,
Viktor Orban.
All of this was a reaction, and it's still, we see even today, we see people like Governor DeSantis in Florida acting. I guess could possibly seeing changes in Israel going on right now. Who knows who the new leaders of the nation will be. So it's a question of agency. So I'm not a pessimist. Neither am I a cockeyed optimist. I think this is an open question. There is no a trajectory of history. It's not going in one way. It's in a way worldly. It's been sipped. I don't really think Anton actually is a super pessimist either. I think he also, and the other people at Claremont, believe this is an ongoing struggle, and then we have to struggle. You know, despair is a sin in Christianity, so you're not supposed to give up. So it's an open question, and I think we can survive.
And in the shorter run, let's end on what is, I guess, on everybody's mind in Israel as well as in America, the midterm elections. Are we going to see the pendulum swing the other way?
I think we're going to see definitely the Republicans win the House, which will change things. They can do investigations, they can do sort of things, and the Senate is a toss-up, but there's a good chance of winning the Senate as well. Particularly, I mean, this gets into the weeds when the money kicks in, and in September and October. We're still in August, the time of this podcast. So yes, Republicans will definitely win the House, and a very good chance of winning the Senate. That will start the process, and I think this is. It's going to be this is a trench warfare. It's going to go on for decades. Okay. We're just beginning.
John said that despair is a sin in Christianity. It reminds me, what is
in Judaism? It's a mitzvah. What do you mean?
What is the only this won't make any sense in a Jewish context, but what is the only sin that can ever be forgiven?
Well, you tell me, because you have something in mind.
Yeah, despair, because the despairing sinner doesn't ask for forgiveness. So
let me just say something in ending this conversation back to the book, because it really is an eye opener. And the introduction to the version that I have, to the edition that I have, is by John O'Sullivan. Who was a Margaret Thatcher advisor, if I'm not mistaken. And he says, well, now John said everything that needs to be said on this. Let's now start acting on this. So, John, you said the struggle is going to be the struggle of the 21st century. We're 2 decades in, and you're still right. Let's see how this developed. I usually tell because this podcast has the habit of interviewing the same people again and again, checking on them, seeing where they are and what their opinions are. Let's go decade by decade and follow this struggle. I'll be happy to have you here on this show again. Thank you very much, John, for coming on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Scotty.